to let you guys know right off the bat, the lecture that I'm going to give is really, it's a left-leaning lecture, okay? So know that, right? It's not necessarily a Marxist lecture. It's a Marxist kind of interpretation of the problem. So know that it leans toward the left, okay? So know that, and of course that's, you know, even though it's, well, we'll give you some socialism at the end, but we'll try to keep it nice and honest, and knowing that, of course, that it's part of an agenda, right? I, as a history professor, you know, you have to take everything with a grain of salt, and you really have to look at things for yourself and make your own decisions. As I said before, this lecture, this particular lecture, is going to be pretty close to being a Marxist interpretation. That kind of eased up a little bit. One thing I have to say about left interpretations or Marxist interpretations is that really good at explaining the problem. Okay, really good at explaining the problem, breaking it down, looking at the problem. Solutions, not so sure if they're that great at the solutions, right? But they're really good at explaining the problems. So with accumulation. All right, now it's filled with paradoxes, right? Affluence coexists with poverty in American society. If you go to Philadelphia and you go to this East Falls area where the governor lives, right? Governor lives in East Falls, right? If you walk 5 blocks from the governor's house, you'll find, and the governor lives in a very affluent neighborhood in Philadelphia. If you walk just 5 blocks from his house, you'll find a high-rise that's you know, filled with people who are poor, right? And so right next to this affluent neighborhood is this very poor neighborhood. And so in many ways, affluence is going to coexist with poverty in the United States, right? I mean, even if you look at our highways, right? For instance, if you live in suburbia and you work downtown, you can use the highway system and go right over top of poverty. You never have to look at poverty, even though you're going, you know, through it. You're going through those neighborhoods, but you're on that system, and so you can, you know, those highways create this atmosphere where you just really don't even have to see the poverty that exists where you work or around where you work, right? And what's going to happen here is that state and corporate power is going to be a product of worker powerlessness. And so in many instances, workers really aren't going to have the power to stand up to the state or stand up to a corporate America. Okay? And so what happens is that income mobility, the ability to rise economically, is really going to be rooted in income stasis for the many, right? And so while the few rise, I mean, we all believe in this notion of the American dream, you know, of this notion of from rags to riches, but the people who go from rags to riches in American society are very, very few, right? And so income stasis is going to be for the many, especially the working poor, okay? And we often use this term marginalized, you know. I am a marginalized minority, underrepresented person. You know, I mean, there's so many names ascribed to what I am or who I am that it's almost impossible. One of those is marginal, right? And I would suggest that working poor are not marginal in American society. Indeed, they're anything but marginal, right? That they are well integrated into the economic system of American society, and we see that often integrated using sexism, institutional racism, and institutional poverty. And you maximize profit, right? There is profit in poverty, okay? There is profit in racism, there is profit in sexism, and there is also profit in class, right? And so you can maximize your profits with poor people, okay? They may be faceless, but they are not excluded, right? We have in African American history what we call the invisible man. And that's the notion that a black man with a uniform on, a janitor's uniform, and a mop in his hand and a smile on his face can walk into any boardroom in American society, any war room, because he's simply faceless, right? He simply becomes a part of the furniture. He becomes a part of the building, right? And so, they are faceless, but they are not excluded, right? And oftentimes they're not only exploited as workers, but also exploited as consumers. And I'll talk more about that. I have a mall, well, I'll talk more about it right now. I have a mall in my neighborhood in Baltimore. I'm from a poor neighborhood in Baltimore. There's a mall in there, in that neighborhood, and the prices in that mall are around 5%. Same stores that you see in, say, a King of Prussia, but the prices are about 5% more in the mall. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, and so they're never going to be equal partners in the social contract, right? And the system is going to underdevelop the working poor rather than help to lift them up. In many ways, it's going to require that they stay in their place, right? And so what we're going to see happening here is collective discrimination in American society based on racism, based on sexism, and also based on poverty. Okay, and the bottom line is to keep these people in their place. You see the use of all sorts of tools, especially the bottom line is going to be intimidation, fear, and violence. If they get out of place, you simply pick up a brick and you bust them in the head. Okay, plain and simple, right? And so we see violence is used oftentimes to keep this system going. Okay, now part of this is coming about because of the ascent of the West, right? And the Western society has this drive, or still probably does have this drive to control the world's human and natural resources. Just want to control nature, control humanity, control people, right? Okay, and what's going to happen is that this drive to control nature and resources is going to lead to a capital accumulation. But that capital accumulation is going to come from colonies where we see workers being exploited, right? It's going to come from piracy. We make heroes out of Sir Walter Raleigh and all those British privateers. As far as the Spanish and the Portuguese were concerned, those people who we make heroes are out of the people who we call the Seahawks. They were nothing more than pirates, right? I mean, they raided Spanish and Portuguese shipping, right? And they were nothing more than pirates. We see this accumulation coming from the slave trade, and if you bought a slave in Africa, you could sell that slave in the Americas for triple the price that you bought him for. So that's a really lucrative trade. And of course, there's the drug trade. The largest exporter of drugs in the world was the British Empire. The British Empire forced opium upon the Chinese, right? It made them take it, right? They had Chinese tried to have a Boston Tea Party, right? So they threw all the opium that the British were sending into the harbor. The British sent warships and enforced forced the Chinese to take opium. One of the things that I like to say is, I ask, is Queen Elizabeth descendants of drug dealers? Okay? We can talk about that, right? We see domestic development, really it's all about conquering people to create these markets, right? You create foreign markets, you dominate the people, you dominate the resources, and you underdevelop the labor and industries that you produce overseas, right? For instance, in Africa, the only industries that Europeans create when they colonize Africa, the only industries that they create are industries that are designed to export the raw materials from Africa. For instance, they might have a tanning industry in order to tan hides so that they can export those hides, right? And so in the infrastructure, right? I mean, you look at Congo, the Belgians occupied the Congo for about 70 years, perhaps a little longer, probably closer to 80, 90 years. 300 miles of road is all that they developed. And those 300 miles of road were designed to remove goods, remove the resources from the Congo, right? I mean, Haverford has 300 miles of road, right? And so in the whole country, the Belgians only build roads to extract goods from the country, right? And what we see is that that creates economic and cultural chaos in the places where colonization is going to take place. So we see this chaos taking place, right? And we have economic amnesia. We forget about the slave trade. We forget about the drugs. We forget that England was the largest drug dealer ever to existed. We forget that, right? We forget about the pirates, right? Or we rename them. We call them the Seahawks, right? We call them privateers. They're not pirates. They're privateers, right? Where I come from, they're pirates, right? And it's no accident that we have this economic amnesia. It makes us feel good. We don't have to worry about the past things. Okay? Now, the dynamics of this degradation, right? Okay? What all of this is going to create is, of course, it's going to create an economic inequality. Okay? Start with migrant and agricultural workers, right? Migrant and agricultural workers. Okay? Usually these migrant workers, their work is seasonal and migratory. They work under contracts. They work for low wages, and they don't get minimum wage. Minimum wage does not apply to agricultural workers, and so they get whatever they can bargain for, right? Usually not in a position of power, they can't bargain for much. And in the early 60s, they had a documentary that came out that looked at these agricultural workers, and they called it Bitter Harvest, right? And they saw how damaging this work was to these people. Okay? Usually you ended up as a sharecropper or a tenant farmer, right? 90% of the sharecroppers were black. 90% of the tenant farmers were white. But they were still both pretty much in the same situation. The only difference between a tenant farmer and a sharecropper is that a tenant farmer was supposed to be working to buy the land. But they're caught in the economic debt system as well, and so they can never actually get enough money from tenant farming to actually ever buy the land, and so they always end up in debt. So sharecropping and tenant farming is going to usually end up, agricultural workers are going to end up in debt trying to do that, right? And that comes from a lien system, right? You got to think that they don't own much already, okay? And so if they want to grow a crop, say cotton, then they have to get the seed from the local store. Okay, sharecropping, right? I get half, I'm the sharecropper, I get half, the person who owns it gets half, right? I don't own anything, okay? All right, so what happens is that when I want to put the seeds in the ground, I go to the person who owns the land, and I say I need seeds, right? And he says, okay, well, you already owe me half, but for these seeds, now you owe me 55%. I don't have any food, okay? I don't have any tools. I don't have a plow, I don't have a mule, and so I go to him and I need a mule, right? And so he says, okay, you get the mule and the plow, but now you owe me 65%, right? I don't have a place to live, but there's a shack on the land that I live on, that I work on, right, that belongs to him. He says, okay, I'll rent you the shack out, right? So now I'm renting the shack out to him. Now I'm up to 80%, right? I gotta eat, right? I don't have any money for food, right? And so eventually, after all things pile up, I end up owing him 25% of next year's crop. So that when I voluntarily stepped into this sharecropping position, right, because I thought I was going to get half and he was going to get half, what ends up is that I end up owing next year's crop. So now I have to stay in that position because I owe that person money. And so it creates this cycle of debt, right? Creates this cycle of debt, and at the general store, prices are inflated so that the food that I buy is going to cost more than it would anyway. Some places, all the way up until the 1970s, used to actually didn't pay people in money. They paid them in what they call company script that could only be used at the general store at these inflated prices, right? And so it's going to create a cycle of debt. That cycle of debt is going to create hopelessness, and that hopelessness often is going to lead to alcohol and drugs. Okay, and so really it's difficult once you're in that position. It's difficult to really get out of that position. Okay, all right. The housing is going to be very inadequate. The housing is usually be temporary housing. It's going to be high rent housing, right? And so, you know, once again, you know, not in the best position, okay? Right? And then there's going to be this notion of convict lease. Notion of convict lease sort of gets started right after the Civil War, right? And what convict lease was is that they created these laws that only applied to black people, right? They called them pig laws, vagrancy laws. They would only enforce these laws when at harvest time or at planting time when they need a lot of labor, right? So if I'm standing on a corner, minding my own business, sheriff comes up to me and says, "You're a vagrant." He puts me in jail, gives me I get a 30-day sentence, right? And then I am leased out to the local planter or the local farmer for those 30 days, and I have to work for those 30 days, right? Of course, that's going to morph into notions of chain gangs and so forth because of these vagrancy laws and pig laws. The other thing that it does is it creates a statistic, because now I am a criminal statistic, right? And so if I'm a police officer, so you got to think, you got all these guys who got pig laws. I'm walking down the street, I got a chicken in my hand, you know, I got a chicken, right? And I don't have a bill of sale for a chicken, like people carry bills of sales around for chickens, right? So I'm thrown into jail, right? Leased out to, you know, to the local planner. But what happens is that I become also a statistic, right? Because in the books it just says theft, right? And so 20 years later, the local police is looking to where he should mostly put his police, right? And so he, you know, local police chief just took over. He's looking at statistics and he says, okay, well, this is where I see a lot of petty theft going on, and so I'm going to put my police officers in this neighborhood, in this black neighborhood where I see all these statistics that say that a lot of petty crime is going on. If you put your police in the black neighborhoods, guess who you're going to capture doing crime? You're going to capture black people. Today, the prison population of America, the black male prison population is 46%, right? African Americans males only make up 6% of the population. So 6% of the population is doing 46% of the crime. Now, I must say black men are busy, but I don't know if they're that busy, right? Okay, creates profile. Urban poor, group that I'm from, okay? You know, I didn't even know I was poor until I got to Villanova, right? You know, before I got to Villanova, I never made more than $14,000 a year in my life, right? And I didn't get to Villanova until I was 43, and I raised a family of 4, right? So I didn't even know I was poor until I got here, right? Urban poor usually ended up being cooks, housekeeping, you know, domestic servants, right? That's one of the prime jobs for it. My mother would fit into this category, having a service job, right? My father was a janitor, okay? In the service industry, clerks, hotel, daycare, home care, those types of jobs, right? Oftentimes you end up doing manual labor, unskilled industrial jobs, working in garments and food preparation. For instance, I worked in for a little while. I worked there 3 days, right? I worked in a chicken factory, right? I just couldn't handle the smell, right? But I worked in a chicken packing factory, right? I couldn't handle the smell, right? But you know, low-paying, minimum wage types of jobs. I remember in 1969, I worked for the Coca-Cola company. I made $2 an hour. I was the richest person in the neighborhood, right? Working 2 hours an hour at 19, right? Usually you get minimum wage, less pay for identical jobs that a white person has, right? And they work, many of these jobs are going to be under the board kind of jobs in the hidden economy. My grandfather raised a family of 7, right? And he never had a job in his life. He never picked up a paycheck in his life. Okay, he never had workman's compensation when he got sick. He never had health care. He never had retirement. His job was actually sort of like, he worked in a neighborhood not unlike Villanova, the neighborhood in Villanova, but in Baltimore, right? He would come out to the county. At first I used to say that he was he cut grass, right? But the more that I thought about it, he didn't just cut grass, he was a landscaper. He might not have gotten paid as a landscaper, but he was a landscaper, right? And so, but he got paid in this hidden economy, so he got paid, cash money, and so he never got any of the benefits that come along with a regular, steady 9-to-5 job, right? Okay. There's very little manufacturing. They say, well, wait a minute. They say, wait a minute, Larry. Now look at your neighborhood, right? I said, before your neighborhood, Italian people used to live in your neighborhood, and they were able to get out, and make it and become middle class. They said, look at it, Jewish people used to live in your neighborhood, and they were able to get out and make it and become middle class. And they said, how come your neighborhood is not able to get out and make it and become middle class? And I stopped thinking, I said, well, part of the problem is that if you go into my neighborhood now, you will find a burnt out factory, a shelf for Revlon, right? They used to make Revlon in my neighborhood, cosmetics in my neighborhood. They used to make Gibbs pork and beans, which is Hunt's ketchup now, in my neighborhood, right? They used to make tennis shoes. You guys know Chuck Taylors? Back then they were Beta Bullets, right? So Beta Bullets actually so Chuck Taylor's Converse has got their start in my neighborhood, right? And you can still see the factories. They're nothing more than shells. You can still see the factories there, but they're pretty much burnt out and nothing more than shells, right? And so you take a place like a Beta Bullet. Beta Bullet started in my Converse, I should say, because they're Converse now, right? They started in my neighborhood. They moved from my neighborhood in the inner city in Baltimore. They moved to Baltimore County. Once they moved to Baltimore County, those people who lived in my neighborhood had transportation problems getting back and forth, right? Still, they moved from Baltimore County to Mexico. Okay, they moved from Mexico to the Philippines. They moved from the Philippines to Korea, all in search of what? Cheap labor. All in search of cheap labor, right? So what started in my neighborhood, really, by the time I got age where I would be a factory worker, those factories no longer existed. I could see them, but they no longer existed, right? You lack benefits, as I said. My grandfather never got workman's comp, he never got unemployment, he never got any of that stuff, right? And unemployment is high. Of course, if he's a landscaper, he can only work during warm months, so he had to save up enough money to get him through the winter, because once again he got no unemployment, right? Okay, and usually ended up in high debt, right? If you're poor, the interest rate, once I got a job at Villanova, I was paying 23% interest rate. I got a job at Villanova, my interest rate went down to 14%. What's going on, When I'm poor, I have to pay a larger interest rate than when I have money to pay it, right? Inadequate transportation. You got to think, once they moved from my neighborhood, that Beta Bullet company moved to the county. People didn't have cars. Public transportation wasn't adequate, or you just simply could not afford it. Today, if you go on to the train that goes along here, you will see that there are many African Americans who will take that R5, they'll take it all the way to the end and Paoli, right? So they got to pay for the price of the ticket from the inner city all the way up to Paoli, right? Once they get off the train in Paoli, they have to wait for a van to pick them up. They have to pay, and that van is going to pick them up to the factory job, right? They have to pay the person in the van, right? So the transportation cost is going to go into them. To the wages that they make, right? Okay. Oftentimes, lots of boarding. The house that I lived in, the house that I grew up in, was a 3-story row house, right? It was a single-family home before African Americans moved into the neighborhood. It was just a single family. We had a whole bunch of single-family 3-story homes. The people took that apartment, that building that a single family used to live in, and they turned it into 6 apartments, right? They had a first floor and second floor, a front, first floor, second floor, and third floor, front and back, right? So they turned it into 6 apartments. We were still using coal. Once we converted to coal, they turned the coal storage area into another apartment, right? And so here's an apartment, here's a building that was designed for a single family that ends up with 7 families living in that building, right? And so housing is always going to be inadequate, right? And there's going to be racial competition and racial animosity. We have this thing we call the wages of whiteness. I don't have any chalk. They switch things on me so much. Oh, here's some chalk. Right. Okay, the wages of whiteness, right? Because it creates racial animosity. And we'll do a little thing for you real quick right now, because this is what we call the wages of whiteness, right? One of the things you got to remember is that, not so much now, because black people can join the unions now, but one of the things that happens, all the way up until the 1940s and 50s, African Americans weren't allowed to join unions, and I would suggest that really they're not really full participants in unions until the 1970s, right? But let's just say, for instance, that the union workers, all white union, they all work for the job, and the job is $10 an hour, right? I'm going to be arbitrary with the figures, so don't get caught up in the figures, okay? So the job is worth $10 an hour, right? Okay, they figure that, hey, I can make $15 an hour, right? Okay, because I think I can, I can work, I think the job is worth $15 an hour, right? And so in order to try to get that $15 an hour, what do you think the union, what's one of the things that the union might do? Okay, go on strike, right? I'm going on strike, okay? I'm going on strike, okay? And so union people go out on strike, right? Now, what happens is that the factory owner turns around and he hires African Americans who can do the job, right? Didn't have them hired before because the union didn't let it, but now the union's not there, and so I hire African Americans, and I pay those African Americans $5 an hour. More than capable of doing the job, right? And $5 an hour looks really good. What do I care about the union? The union won't accept me anyway, so what do I care? I don't have any loyalty to the union, right? And so I take the job making $5 an hour. What am I called? What am I? What's happening to their strike? Anybody? I am a strikebreaker, right? Anybody know what we call strikebreakers? What we call strikebreakers in American society? Come on.
Don't they call them scabs?
We call them scabs, right? Scabs. A black festering sore. Okay? Think about it. A black festering sore, right? So we call them scabs, right? All right, so we hire, you hire these African Americans. They don't have any loyalty to the union, right? And so, of course, now I'm paying them $5 an hour, so hey, what do I care about this strike, right? And so, of course, the strike does what? It fails. I'm a worker. I'm a white worker, and I look at the strike failing, and who do I blame for the strike failing? I blame those African Americans. It's those African Americans, those black people. Those black people had to come in and taken my job, my strike would have worked, right? So now I'm jobless, okay? I need my job back. I need my job back, right? And so, more than likely the factory owner is racist as well, right? And so more than likely he doesn't mind, hiring, he'd much rather hire white workers. And so he's, so I come to him and I say, look, I need my job back, right? And so he says, okay, you can have your job back, not a problem. You can have your job back, but remember that $10 an hour you were getting, you're not getting that anymore, right? You're not getting that anymore. Now, I'm not going to insult you by paying you the same thing that I paid those black people, but you ain't getting $10 an hour. You're going to get now $7.50 an hour, right? We call that the wages of whiteness. Because you're white, instead of getting $10 an hour, you get $7.50. And we call that the wages of whiteness, right? Okay? And I'm still mad at those black people, because if it wasn't for those black people, I'd be making at least a 10. Now I'm not even making a 10, right? And so it creates all sorts of racial animosity. It creates all sorts of competition. What should have happened, ideally, is that you let the black people join the union, then they have a vested interest in the union, they have a vested interest in the strike, and maybe the strike doesn't fail, right? But we gotta remember that you get higher profits from labor of the poor, okay? And that's really the heart and soul of underdevelopment, because poverty equals profit, right? You can hire the poor at a lower rate. You can charge them more for goods and services. And so really, as far as profit makers are concerned, it's a win-win situation, right? And that's the heart and soul of underdevelopment. We have all sorts of failed policies and programs, right? I remember that in the early 70s, right, when Nixon was president, they had this notion of enterprise zone. They were going to take part of my community and turn it into this industrial center, right? And Nixon flew into my neighborhood in a helicopter, right? It was really wild. It was crazy, right? He just flew down to the helicopter. Everybody was out there. We were going to make turn this into this industrial park. Only one factory ever made it to that industrial park, right? And so it never created the types of jobs that that it was said to have done. Now, I don't want to be hard on Nixon because I haven't seen a whole lot of other things coming from the other side of the aisle either. Okay, I don't see a whole lot of answers on that side of the aisle either, right? And we simply end up with failed policies and failed programs, right? Before I do the illegal work, because I'm going to, urban poor people, that's me, right? So I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the urban poor people with housing, right? We had this one family in my neighborhood we called the Gypsies, right? We called them the Gypsies, right? Because they would move every 3 or 4 months. They would move, right? But they didn't move anywhere, okay? They moved down the street. They moved across the street. They moved around the corner. I mean, they never moved any more than 2, 3, or 4 blocks from the original place, right? But every 3 or 4 months they would move, right? I mean, they would call us all together to help them. We'd be walking down the street with sofas and, carrying sofas to the next apartment, right? What do you think's going on there? What do you think? What do you think? Why are they moving every 3 or 4 months? Really simple. Come on. They work exactly, right? You pay the first month's rent, first couple of weeks' rent, and then it takes 3 months to get evicted. So they pay first couple of weeks' rent, and then they stay there for 3 months, and then when it was time to get evicted, they just moved to another place, right? Landlords didn't care. They may have cared about getting their money, but initially, there's no communication with them, and so they just rent to whoever is willing to buy, rent those places, right? And so lots of failed policies, right? Immigrant workers and illegal aliens, okay? That's another category. And immigrant workers and illegal aliens, you see, they're fleeing. They're economic immigrants, right? They're economic illegal aliens, not mostly political alien immigrants, right? But there's usually some type of political and economic upheaval at home, often caused by globalization, notions of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, all of those types of agreements between the United States and, say, for instance, Mexico is going to open those borders up, right? And it's also going to create poverty in places, in some places in Latin America. And so those people are going to begin to flee, and come across the border to try to, make a better life for themselves. Okay? We see all sorts of immigrants coming to American society. They come come across the borders, they come in boats. And it's not just American society, it's a global immigration kind of problem that we see that we have right now. For instance, the shortest distance between Africa and Europe is about 7 miles, right? It's right there at the Rock of Gibraltar, the Straits of Gibraltar, right there. Right now, that is a dying field, right this very second, because Africans are trying to escape the poverty in Africa and make their way to Europe, right? And so very oftentimes the same situation that we see on our Mexican border, where we get agents who bring them across in those crowded vans and trucks, and you know, they lock the back door, and then you open the back door and people are suffocated and things like that. Same type of situation over there, right? People get in those boats, they get out into the middle of the Mediterranean. For some reason, the broker leaves them. They can't run the boat sinks, people die, right? Right now, this very second, a dying field. I'd like to say a killing field because of those brokers, right? But I will at least say it's a dying field, okay? We get all sorts of immigrants from Mexico, Cuba, Haitians, Filipinos, other types of Asians, especially Vietnamese, who are the boat people. And so we get immigrants from all sorts of areas, right? Okay? Many of them are going to end up illegal, and they're going to go into that hidden economy. You got to remember that hidden economy, it helps to make the country go, right? My grandfather kept all the lawns nice and clean, right? Kept all the landscape well manicured, right? And so he's helping the economy to go, right? They get paid, once again, hidden economy, paid under the board, low wages, right? Okay? And once again, those brokers and contracts, they exploited, you know, especially women, right? You've all heard the stories of the Chinese women who come over here to get a job, and the broker, and they sign a contract, and once they get here, they find out that the job is prostitution. Not just Chinese women, East European women fall into that same trap, right? And it's not just the United States. They fall into that same trap going to other places, right? And so it becomes a real problem of exploitation of people, okay? And immigrant workers and illegal aliens end up getting the worst of both, right? And so they end up being rural workers and urban workers, usually the last one on the list. All right, okay? Poor working conditions, sweatshops. We've all heard about the sweatshops. Kathy Lee Gifford, remember a couple of years back, her clothing line was being produced by a sweatshop in Latin America, right? This is a particular, the Triangle Factory fire in 1911. You know, they had placed all these immigrant workers from Eastern Europe into, into one of these sweatshops. The sweatshop gets poured up, catches on fire, and most are going to end up dying. They have very few rights. They have no benefits. They lack legal or protection or recourse, right? I mean, they just got to kind of set up. Be quiet and just, take whatever's handed to them, okay? Okay? And they always have to face the threat of deportation. Right now, immigration problem in American society, the illegal alien, not the immigration problem, but the illegal alien problem is a situation that we really face, and we need to come up with some really good answers, right? But they're faced with all sorts of unfavorable policies, and oftentimes, if I'm an African American, this happens to me with illegal aliens, right? I mean, it's the same type of thing, okay? You hear African Americans complaining about Mexicans undercutting the jobs that were traditionally theirs, right? And that once again creates what? Racial animosity between two groups. Okay, dynamics of dependency. How do we keep this all in place? We keep it in place through political and social inequality. It's inequality. That's how we keep it in place. Okay, that's we make people dependent. Okay, we maintain this underclass, and we use all sorts of devices to help to maintain this underclass. Right? Okay. Of course, this underclass has political, very little political influence. They either don't vote, or as in the case of illegal aliens, they're not allowed to vote. In my neighborhood, they don't vote, they don't care. So what difference does it make? Republican, Democrat, black, white? Doesn't make any difference. Why am I going to go out and vote for? It doesn't make a difference. I don't see a difference between a Democrat and a Republican. Guys might see some differences, but to me, they're all the same, right? I don't see a whole lot of differences. Their policies might have subtle differences, but their policy is still always going to favor corporate America, right? And they said, look, Baltimore. Baltimore had a black mayor for 12 years. Everybody was happy. Yeah, we got a black mayor. Everybody's happy, right? Everybody who was poor before he became mayor was poor after he left, right? And so, as a matter of fact, in many instances, because they had a black mayor, they lost business, right? And so it actually, in many ways, worked out to the adverse, right? No independent capital base, you lose your job. I got a neighbor, right? White guy, right? He lost his job 8 months ago. He ain't worried about it. He could care less, right? I lose my job, I go ballistic. I can't imagine how I'm going to live, right? You say, I'll find a job when I want. Okay. If I lose my job, if I lost this job in Villanova, I guarantee you I'll be out there tomorrow mopping floors somewhere. That's how I made it through college. That's why when you come to me with the excuses I had to work doesn't mean anything to me. Because I mop floors at a mental institution to get through college, right? And I was a 34-year-old freshman, okay? So, and no independent capital base, right? Nothing separate, no trust funds or any of those types of things, no inheritance, so no independent capital base, okay? Lack leadership, community lacks leadership, they lack organization, and without that, you really can't make it too much in American society, right? And there's, of course, always those assumptions of cultural and intellectual inferiority. Now, the way I see it, we talk about affirmative action, right? Especially you guys, affirmative action is way wrong as far as you can see, right? You say to yourself, okay, well, wait a minute, affirmative action, right? All right, now, we got this black guy and this white guy who grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same high school, essentially had the same social economic background, and when it comes time to go to college, might even got similar grades, right? And when it comes time to go to college, the black guy gets an affirmative action break and the white guy doesn't. And that's not fair. People say that all the time, it's not fair, right? Well, I'm gonna tell you about affirmative action, okay? In my neighborhood, I only know one person. By the way, the dropout rate for black males in my neighborhood is 80%. So 80% of the black males in my neighborhood do not graduate from high school. What are we going to do with them? Think about what they're going to do, okay? All right, but the only person I know to ever benefit from affirmative action from my neighborhood is guess who? Me, right? And they say, well, aren't you afraid that people will accuse you of only getting the job and only getting your education because of affirmative action? And I mean, doesn't that make you feel really bad about that? And I said, yeah, I feel bad all the way to the bank, right? Then I'll cash my check. I don't feel bad no more. But affirmative action, I don't think it should be race-based. I think it should be class-based. I think poor white people are just as bad shape as poor black people, right? And so I don't think it should. I think this should be affirmative action, but I think it should be class-based, not race-based. I think poor people should get some type of break, right? But there's this assumption once again of intellectual and cultural inferiority, right? I asked my class last semester, do you think that everybody, all the black people, and my class has more black people than the normal criminal class, right? We have about 8 or 9, right? Sometimes at least 6, right? Which is a lot. The class says, they say that, a black person is at Villanova either because of athletics or affirmative action. That's what you guys think. Either athletics or affirmative action, right? Because why? Okay? Couldn't have made it there on their merit, right? Okay, and popular culture and aesthetics reinforce those racial images. I mean, if you look at even the Academy Awards, right? If you look at the Academy Awards the black people have won over the years, right? I mean, the first Academy Award won by a black person is a slave. She wins it as a slave. I ain't birthing no babies. Born, gone with the wind, right? Next person to win an Academy Award, first black male to win an Academy Award was Sidney Poitier in the movie, I forget, Lilies of the Field, right? Where these white nuns work him to death. I mean, they work him to death building the chapel all by himself, so he's nothing more than a common laborer. Denzel wins he wins an Academy Award for being a crooked cop in one and a slave in the other. So even the Academy Award, Halle Berry, you know, they said Halle Berry has this groundbreaking role that she won an Academy Award for. I looked at the movie, all I saw her doing was making love to a white guy. They've been showing black women making love to white guys in the movies ever since I can remember. You know, they said it was a groundbreaking role. I mean, she was the classic Jezebel, right? You know, that sexual female, right? And so reinforced racial stereotypes and images help to keep this helps to maintain that underclass. Right? Okay. Education system is a joke. You know, no child left behind is a joke, and anything that the Democrats had before, that was a joke too. Okay? And in America, if you're white and you live in the inner city, if you're white and you live in the city of Philadelphia, you go to private school. Plain and simple. Right? If you live in, especially if you live in a black neighborhood or close to a black neighborhood, right? The education system today is more segregated in 2008 than it was in 1970. And yet Brown versus the Board of Education, right? We have the tradition of denial, right? You know, and what really comes about is this notion of creating a literate, cheap, dependable workforce. And so you only educate enough to create that dependable workforce, right? That cheap labor force, right? This guy looks like he's from my neighborhood. Actually, looks like my grandfather. It's that before. Right? Okay. All right. And you become dependent on a cycle of poverty, right? Cycle of debt, cycle of crime, jail, drugs, death. You know, it's all. You know, they look at me. They say, "Hey, Larry, how come you were able to get out of your neighborhood and get ahead, and everybody else in your neighborhood what?" So I said, good question. How come? I have to think about that for a second. I said, well, look, let me think about me and my neighborhood. I said, well, okay, you know, everybody in my neighborhood works. Everybody might not have a job, but everybody works, right? And everybody in my neighborhood grabs after that brass ring, right? I grabbed after that brass ring every day of my life, right? Just like everybody in my neighborhood. I just so happened one day I grabbed that and I looked and it was in my hand, you know. You know, how was I able to get out of the neighborhood? Luck. I could have at any point in time got into a car, that car had been stopped, something illegal going on, I go to jail. At any point in my life. Well, not since I've been to Villanova, right? Right. But at any point in my life, that could have happened, you know, easily, right? Cycle of poverty, cycle of debt, cycle of drugs. I mean, you know, being poor, you know, we used to have these welfare goods, right, that they used to give us, canned goods, right? They didn't have any labels on them, right? And so you know, we called it mystery cans, right? And so we, you know, you used to open it up and you know, whatever you got, you got. Lots of times they were beets. I grew up hating beets. I can't stand beets right now because they came out of these mystery cans, right? We used to get peanut butter in a can, about this big around, right? And the oil would lay on the top, right? I was talking to my class about it one time, right? And they looked at me and they said, that's the good stuff now. That's all natural, right? With the layer of oil on the top. It wasn't all natural when I was using it, right? You know, I fell asleep every night to the pitter-patter of little feet running through my wall, right? Every night. I thought it was normal. The pitter-patter of little feet running through my wall, right? I grew up with rats, right? I grew up with them, right? I'll bust a rat in the head with a brick in a half a second, right? Right? 'Cause I grew up fighting. Yeah, you know, but that comes out of poverty, right? And once again, I didn't even know I was poor, like I said, until I got to Villanova. All right, global implications, all sorts of global implications. One of the things that happens is that our manufacturing, our industry, and when I say our, I'm meaning not just American society, but Western society, industrial society. So not just even Western, we can throw Japan, and now we can start to throw China into that mix as well, even though they call themselves communists, right? We can start to throw them in the mix as well. they take it and they flood overseas markets, right, with cheap goods. And those cheap goods destroy local manufacturing, right? In India is a perfect example. India used to be the largest producer of cloth in the world, right? Okay? England comes along, the Industrial Revolution comes along. England's cloth is cheaper, better. They flood Indian markets with that cheaper, better cloth. What happens to the Indian production of cloth? It just goes out, it falls to the wayside. And so instead of producing cloth, now they produce agricultural products, raw materials for consumption by the industrial nation. One of those raw materials, of course, is going to be opium. Okay? We create unique national minorities, cheap dependent workforces. You know, in Fuji Islands, the South Pacific, the largest group after the Fujis make up about 51% of the population. Indians from India make up the other 49% of the population. Vijay Singh, you guys know him, the golfer? He's not from India. He's from Fuji. He's a Fujian. Fujian, whatever. He's one of them, right? And so you create, English society was, the British Empire was good for taking workers and spreading people all around the world, right? Saudi Arabia has the same types of problems, right? A dependent cheap workforce from Africa, right? So it's just not, the United States that we see this creation of unique national minorities, and of course in the United States, Latinos could really fit into that category, right? And once again, they become an integral, necessary part of capitalist society. You need them. You got to have losers. If you have winners, you're going to end up with losers. There's no way around it, right? Simply no way around it. You're going to have losers, right? And there's profit in having those losers. I was going to tell you about that Mondawmin, right? Mondawmin is that shopping center, right? Once again, and that shopping center prices are about if I walk into a shoe store, if I walk into, say, Tom McGann's, if I walk into Tom McGann's in that shopping center in my neighborhood, the shoe will cost $29.95. If I go to the same Tom McGann's in King of Prussia, the shoe will cost $24.95. If I go into that supermarket in my neighborhood, the milk price will be $1.70. If I walk into a supermarket in Villanova, that milk would cost $1.50. Why? Because in Villanova, I can go to this supermarket, or I can go to that supermarket, or I can get in my car and drive 5 miles to that supermarket, right? I can go to this shopping center, I can go to King of Prussia. If I don't like that, I can go to Plymouth Meeting. If I don't like that, I can go to Granite Run. If I don't like that, I can go to, I forget the other one, right? I can go to someplace else, right? In my neighborhood, that transportation doesn't exist. And so there's only one place to shop, and they know it's only one place to shop, and so they raise the prices, right? Profit in poverty, okay? All right? NeoColonialism, I blame the problems in Africa on Africans. I don't blame them on colonial people, even though colonial people are the roots of many of those problems. I blame the problem on Africans. That doesn't escape the fact of this neo-colonialism, right? And in many instances, part of the problem is that their economies are being controlled by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank. And of course, they're both out of Washington and New York. And so I loan the people money, I loan this nation of money, right? And I tell a nation like Nigeria, or not Nigeria, Ghana. Take a nation like Ghana. Ghana can grow all the food that Ghana needs to eat, right? But I give them that money and I say, I don't want you to grow food. I can sell you food. What I want you to do is I want you to grow rubber. So you have to take this money and use it to grow rubber, right? Okay? And you have to sell that rubber to guess who? Me. And I'll tell you what the price is that I'm going to sell that rubber to. And then you have to also pay back the loan that I gave you in order to sell that rubber, in order to plant that rubber, right? And so really, once again, and bottom line is I can sell you rice, right? And so it becomes a win-win situation for for those industrialists, for the capitalists, right? I talked earlier about flooding markets with cheap goods. It's not only cheap goods, but oftentimes substandard goods. Right now, Gerber floods African markets with substandard baby food. Baby food that we wouldn't give to our children, they give to the Africans. And you know what they say? It's better than nothing. It's better than nothing, right? I don't know about that one, okay? Toward the future, right? Okay? We need to chart a realist. Oh, these are my solutions. Okay, so once again, I'm gonna have to take off my coat because I know these are some socialist solutions, right? So I know I'm gonna have to fight y'all. Right? So I don't care. I'll take y'all on. I'm ready for you. Anybody who wanna go first? All right, let's go. All right, chart a realist course, right? We need to abolish this underdevelopment and lessen poverty. I mean, poverty is it's destructive. I mean, it brings everybody down, right? It just brings everybody down. Okay? We need to analyze the historical foundations and the apparatus of poverty. Profit, that's what creates poverty, right? Racism and sexism. Why does racism continue to exist? Because there is profit in racism. Take the profit out of it, you don't need it anymore. Why does sexism continue to exist? There is profit in sexism. Women only make 70% of what a man makes, right? So there's profit in sexism. Ain't that right, Bob? Okay? And we need to realign the capitalist system. I said it, that's right, I said it, I mean it. Okay, we need to realign the capitalist system. I'm not saying get rid of it, right? I just say realign it, right? With more equitable distribution of wealth. Okay, a more equitable distribution of wealth, right? Okay, beginning points. Okay, y'all ready? We need to socialize. I said it, I'm not taking it back. Okay, we need to socialize 3 areas as far as I'm concerned, right? Education. Why should even a Villanova exist? You don't come to Villanova to get the same education. You come to Villanova to get a better education. You come to Villanova to get a superior education, right? You come to Villanova not for equal education, but for something better, right? Okay? So education, socialize. Healthcare. Why should the amount of money in my pocket make a difference on the healthcare that I get? Right? Should make a difference, right? Should make a difference. And the justice system, right? The justice system. I had a student one time. She was on a women's basketball team. She got jumped down on South Street. Biggest person in the room. I don't know why the person decided to jump on her, right? So, he jumped on you? I said, yeah. I said, okay, right? So she went to court, to testify against this guy, right? But that trial was the last trial of the day, right? And so she stood, she sat in the court and she watched all the trials that took place, right? She came back, she told me in the class, she said, look, she said, Professor Little, she said, it didn't make any difference if you were black. It didn't make any difference if you were white. It didn't make any difference if you were Latino. She said, if you had your own lawyer, then your case either got postponed or it got dropped. If you had a public defender, you went to jail. Plain and simple, right? Didn't make any race didn't make any difference. Class, of course, poverty, right, made a difference because they couldn't afford their own attorney. So race didn't make any difference, ethnicity didn't make any difference. The only thing that made a difference was money in your pocket, right? None of the rest of the stuff made, okay, all right, pretty good. So none of that stuff made a difference, right? So that's right, I'm ready to fight anybody who says we shouldn't socialize. Come up and smack me one at a time if you want. I'll just stand here and take it, right? All right, but I got something for you, okay? I got something for you. You don't have to take my socialist ideas. Take the Pope's socialist ideas. Right? This Pope's socialist ideas are good. I like his idea. I like his socialist ideas, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with the Pope, right? He's a good guy. Right? Take the Pope's socialist ideas. Rerum Novarum, right? If you haven't read Rerum Novarum, none of your courses have sent you there. I'm sending you there. Read it. Okay? Go read it. Just do a Google search. Rerum Novarum, right? Do a Google search. It's Catholic social thought, right? Catholic social thought. That's key. I mean, those of you who are Catholic and those of you who aren't Catholic, right? One of the things that you should think about is how Catholic social thought looks at the world, right? How it looks at race, how it looks at poverty, how it looks at these things, right? Okay? According to Catholic social thought, this is Pope Leo, okay? 1800s, right? According to Catholic social thought, it's the dignity of work that counts. It's not the work itself, it's the dignity of the work that counts. The worker is what's primary. The work is secondary. What he produces is only secondary. It's the worker that's primary. This is the Pope talking now. This is not me. This is the Pope. Okay? He says that it should be a priority of labor over capital. Capital shouldn't come first. Labor should come first. People should come first before money, before profits. Right? That's what he says, right? He says what we need in this society is a just wage, right? A wage that people can make a living off of, a working, we need to, a living wage, a wage that people can make a decent living off of, and make their lives better, right? We need to improve working conditions for everybody, right? And we need to give preferential treatment to the poor. If you haven't been on a mission trip yet, you need to go. Plain and simple, you need to go. Okay, I'm challenging you to go. If you haven't been on a mission trip, anybody been on a mission trip? Don't they need to go? Don't the ones who didn't, don't they need to go? You need to go. Okay, plain and simple, right? Preferential treatment for the poor. You think of the poor first. Think of yourself second. Preferential treatment, right? The ultimate question is the right to work and receive wages that contribute to an adequate standard of living. Is that a basic human right? I mean, do we have that as a basic human right? If we do, then we need to make some changes, okay? Why doesn't this person deserve a decent job, a decent wage, right? Okay? Any questions? I know I was fast, right? I know. I was zooming. I know I was zooming, right? If anybody wants to stop by, I have outlines of this lecture. If anybody wants to stop by later and get some outlines of this lecture, I'm up in the history department, 431, right? I can give you outlines. Any questions? Oh, everything came through with perfect clarity, Professor Little, right? Everything came through. No questions at all? Come on.
How do you see the reformation of the education system so that there's quality of education?
I think one of the things that happen with the education system in particular is the way that we fund education, right? We usually fund education is usually funded by property tax, right? And there are those who would suggest that that doesn't make a difference. But if we take New Jersey, for instance, if we look at the richest county in New Jersey, which is Princeton, and we look at the high school graduates and those number of graduates who go on to college, then we see that it's well above the 90% level, right? Then we go back down to Camden, the poorest neighborhood in New Jersey, same property, property taxes fund the education, right? And we see that the dropout rate might not be as bad as my neighborhood, 80%, but it's still probably around 60 or 70%, and who don't even graduate from high school, and so of course the number of people who attend college is much less. And so I would suggest that the first kind of thing to do is to get rid of this notion of property taxes in order to fund education, right? I'm not a big fan of No Child Left Behind either. I'm just not a big fan of it. As a matter of fact, they tricked me with No Child Left Behind, right? Because this guy down in Houston, a black guy down in Houston, who became the first Secretary of Education under this No Child Left Behind program, I looked at the statistics, right? And he actually, within a year, he actually had turned that school system around, right? Where the dropout rate was somewhere around 50%, he had lowered that dropout rate to somewhere around 20 to 30%. And I said, oh, goodness gracious, he's got a great plan. This is a fantastic plan, right? I said, this is what we need in American society. And then Bush made him Secretary of Education. I said, yeah, that's what we need. And then I looked at how he implemented his plan. What he did is he took all those people who are at risk and he threw them out of the high school. You throw all the people at risk out of the high school, then your numbers are going to go up immediately, right? So what I thought was a fantastic plan. Actually, not only did he leave children behind, but he didn't even try to take them with him, right? He threw them, and not even did he leave them behind, but he threw them out, right? And so So I'm not a big fan of No Child Left Behind, but I think our education system, public education system, is a joke anyway. You know, I just don't think it's good. Maybe it's good in Bucks County, but in Philadelphia County, it's not good at all. Anything else? Healthcare, justice, those are my social life. And I'm not saying get rid of capitalism, I'm just saying distribute the wealth, right? You know, people in Wall Street, I just don't even understand Wall Street, you know? I mean, here are people who don't do anything except for shuffle paper, and now they don't even need paper. Now they just shuffle electronics back and forth every day. They're shuffling figures, numbers back and forth, trying to become rich on the stock market, and they don't do nothing else. I just don't even understand it. I don't even understand the notion of speculating in order to try to make money. It seems like you might as well go to Atlantic City and do the roulette wheel, right? And yet, what they speculate on has an influence on those poor people that I've been talking about, right? It's really crazy. I just don't even understand, right? Capitalism at its finest. Remember, Adam Smith said that greed is good, and we all believe in Adam Smith. God said greed is a sin. So who's right? I'll leave it at that. Yeah. You tell me.